Hey, Dark Enlightenment, welcome back to the show, man. How have you been?
I've been well, man. Thank you so much for having me back. As usual, I really enjoy the program, and I think you've been knocking it out of the park lately. So,
Oh, thank you, man. Thank you for the kind words. Well, so we've been chatting a bit over text like the last few weeks, and this is something that has really been in the back of my mind lately is kind of like the emergence of this anti-neocon, like paradoxically anti-neocon Israel first right that you see popping up among institutions such as like the Claremont Institute or like so-called like national conservatism. And I'm going to caveat this as well. These organizations actually ostensibly put out decent content on a host of issues, whether it's like generic immigration restriction or even some foreign policy issues at the margin. But they generally stop short, especially when you start talking about like organized Jewry and its impact on subverting the US and its foreign policy. So you've been observing this trend for a while, and I'd say probably been longer than myself because I remember some of this stuff in the global war on terror era. But what would you say are like the primary institutions behind this subversion, and what do they typically engage in?
well, I would say that the whole Claremont Institute, for lack of a better term, universe is all of one piece, right? They have their American Mind website, they have their Claremont Review of Books, they have the Claremont Institute, and Claremont Mechanic College is one of the few like places you can actually get a PhD in political science and not be shot by communists. So they understand the importance of institutions. And to give them as much credit as I possibly can, they are the only establishment right institution that understood what time it was in 2016. And National Review had that embarrassing like Never Trump cover with all these,
Yeah.
like now people who are pro Trump, like Glenn Beck and whatever, all of these people who are. So Claremont actually does good work. And if you can put on your JQ classes, there's a lot there that's actually pretty valuable. But so much of what they talk about, especially as Straussians, is like exoteric stuff. And so they're not people who believe that you just need to be honest straight away, like I do and like others do, right? So they'll talk about, they published Angelo Codavilla's like a Flight 93 election or whatever. And I don't know if it was Angelo Codavilla or
I think that was Michael Anton.
right. Yeah, that was Michael Anton. So like, but they'll publish Michael Anton, and they will actually talk about the fact that the conservative movement has conserved nothing and how useless like AEI was. The great Z-Man had a great podcast touching on this stuff yesterday on his show. But Jonah Goldberg wrote like a liberal fascism, this ridiculous book that Paul Gottfried.
Awful. Yeah.
Yeah. But Jonah Goldberg, between his 400 grand a year salary at National Review, his his gimme job at AEI, publishing rights for his quote unquote book, and his wife's various jobs in the deep state, the Goldberg family was pulling like over $1 million a year to basically wreck America, right? And when you can't conserve the girls' bathroom, what are you doing? And so to give Claremont as much credit as possible, right? They are among the few establishment right types that actually understand what time it is, that like the existential nature of the problem, that mass immigration and modern liberalism aren't just we'll get over it. And, we got over the 70s. No, this is like total destruction of civilization type levels of stuff. But they're all Japhaites, right? And they all worship Lincoln. And they all have this bizarre notion of like a second founding. And Z-Man put it best, like how can you believe in like a Trotsky permanent revolution and call yourself a conservative? And the answer is you can't, right? That's why I have the nom de guerre I do, is sometime around 2007 or 2008, after reading Moldbug and then discovering older, even better writers than him, right, I realized that the whole project of America was liberal. The whole Enlightenment idea is wrong. John Locke is wrong. I mean, there's some stuff he's right about, sure. Like you can't have atheists, but Charles Haywood will talk about the essence of liberalism being the liberation from all non-chosen, voluntarily chosen bonds, and that anything that you don't like choose yourself is inherently evil. So the family is evil, the nation is evil, biology is evil, gravity is evil. Liberals will literally, if you said, like, I, Jose, believe I can fly, and everything, like society should bend all its efforts to making it so that whatever is in my head and the reality of the like I can fly should match. So you have to, come up with like anti-gravity boots so that I can realize my true potential of actualize myself as a guy who can fly. And it's only slightly more ridiculous than perverted narcissists like Bruce Jenner being told like, I'm a beautiful woman on the inside.
Yeah.
And this is Ta-Nehisi Coates was on CBS, and he made a fool of himself. This one Jewish guy, convert actually, Tony something or other. His ex-wife lives in Israel. He's currently married to Zoe Tur, Tur. Zoe Tur's father is the tranny who threatened Ben Shapiro on live television, right? So this whole, and I only bring this up to show that all of these kind of institutions, everybody knows everybody, and they're all very small. The world of conservative Inc. is only got a couple thousand people in it. You'd be worth reaching out to Greg Hood or Paul Kersey because they both worked in places like this. But what Claremont will do is like admit, oh, you have face-eating cancer. Unlike the rest of the conservative party, conservatives will tell you that like the gigantic tumor where your right eyebrow used to be is bad. We need to cut that out. I'm like, okay, good. Sure. Good start. But you didn't want to do anything about where the cancer started, in the heart. And in order to do that, you fundamentally, I've said before, I'll continue to say until people get it, like until you address the JQ, it's like trying to do physics without Newton's laws of motion. You're just going to be wrong.
Yes. I want to go back to 2 points you raised that I think would be of great educational value to my listeners. You mentioned Straussians and Japhites. Could you expand upon those two figures? Because these seem to be, I think, almost a common link among every like permutation of like conservative, like establishment conservative and like neocon intellectual in like the US.
So Leo Strauss was a political scientist who specialized, I believe, in Plato and Machiavelli. And he actually has some really interesting stuff out there. He's taught political science at University of Chicago, which is one of the few like genuinely serious universities in America. And there was a split amongst his students. Of course, he's Jewish, right? He was able to have a profound influence on American political thought. He had some great ideas about the necessity of reading the text as others would have read it at the time, and not imposing your preconceived notions on it, and reading it as it was written to the audience it was intended for. But he gets his PhD from Hamburg and then comes to the United States and teaches all kinds of places. I don't know what the split was over, but there's like the East Coast Straussians and the West Coast Straussians. And the West Coast Straussians become embedded at Claremont College. And Claremont is one of the few places in Southern California. And it's one of the few places you can get a PhD in political science without being surrounded by communists. They made it a conservative college. And they have this whole universe of websites and, American Mind podcast and Claremont Review of Books and the college and a whole bunch of other stuff. They understand the importance of institutions very, very well, which is one of the reasons they're so effective. But he had a student, Strauss did, Henry Jaffa. And Henry Jaffa is an interesting fellow because he like worships Lincoln. I don't think that's putting it too strongly. This guy.
Oh, no. Absolutely. That's a very accurate description.
And, I'm a Southern nationalist, have been for years. Like the Southern nationalist, libertarian, old republic idea of Lincoln is like completely anathema to this guy. And he just absolutely believes that Lincoln like refounded America, and that the Civil War like made the principles inherent in the Declaration actualized. And they're all kind of Trotskyists. The West Coast Straussians are at least not as ridiculous as the East Coast ones, but they still have this ridiculous notion of permanent revolution, like Trotskyist permanent revolution. And so you can't be a conservative in any meaningful sense in a place where you're constantly believing in revolution. Because, to use a contemporary example, right? How are you going to complain about the George Floyd riots if you can't just accept that the African population is just like that? If you don't accept that they're just like this, they're relatively low IQ, violent, sexually incontinent, and not really able to think ahead very much. And so stuff like this is just going to happen, right? Or the recent news with like the Georgetown, basketball player who was, given some kind of side issue job and, just went psycho, stabbed a cop. Like if you just don't, if you just accept that, oh no, that's racist. Well, is it racist or is it just being realistic about the way the world actually is? And again, to give the guys at Claremont some credit, they do a better job than anyone else in establishment conservatism of actually understanding the stakes and actually knowing what time it is and being upset, rightfully so, at just how insane the modern left is. But they won't be honest about certain things. And those things that they won't be honest about are like the nature of the JQ, because one of their main faces of their organization is Spencer Klavan, who is the son of the Daily Wire's Andrew Klavan, an ethnic Jew who's a convert to Christianity. Spencer was raised, I think, Episcopalian. Spencer is a homosexual, rather sodomite, who is sodomitically married, quote unquote, to the Daily Wire's lead lawyer. So if the main host of their podcast and the guy who he's got a PhD in the classics, I think Spencer Klavan does. He's got some sort of background in classics. So he's doing what Strauss did in rereading the classics, rereading Aristotle and Machiavelli and Plato as they were. And he's got a podcast, I think, talking about these texts, which is good. They're important texts to read. But he's a gay Jew who's fake married to another gay Jew working for the Daily Wire. So how antagonistic can Claremont be to Daily Wire when they're literally sleeping together? Right. I mean, yeah. So you can't be honest about the fact that, and let's not forget too, that Breitbart was born in Israel, and that Ben Shapiro left Breitbart over the Corey Lewandowski, shoving somebody, quote unquote, shoving somebody in 2016. I mean, I'm absolutely certain that was all planned, and that he had the Mercer money or whatever, whoever was funding Daily Wire. He had all that set up, and now Daily Wire is the 800-pound gorilla on the right. They had Andrew Klavan and Jordan Peterson and whoever else lined up and ready to go and ready to launch, and I'm certain of it, with money and Ben Shapiro
agree as well. Yeah.
Ben Shapiro moved to Nashville, right? L'chaim, y'all, right? Okay, well, wearing a cowboy hat and being in Nashville, right? Well, wait a second, Ben. Tennessee might be a volunteer state, but this is not, Ben Shapiro's family. His mother is a big deal entertainment lawyer. The gal who played Matilda in the Matilda movie from the early 2000s is Ben Shapiro's cousin.
Fun fact.
Yeah, well, but so he's not this outsider, right? He's deeply embedded in Hollywood.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
And so
guy's basically chosen.
Yeah. And ever he was given a WorldNet Daily. Fun fact, also the former employer, our own Gregory Hood. But he was given a Daily Wire, or not Daily, WorldNet Daily like column when he was like in high school or something, or right out of college, and he graduated. And he's very smart, like Ben Shapiro is very, very bright. He was able to graduate college early and go to law school and graduate, before he was 23 or something like that. And he's coach writer. He's managed to write several books. I haven't written several books, so I can't, criticize him on that score, I guess. But nevertheless, right, he's coming to this place, Tennessee, that has an organic way of life. And he's saying, well, if we really understand America, Memphis would be a paradise if we just give people free markets and Judeo-Christian values, right? and you can't understand Memphis without understanding that there's just some things that are inherent, and there was a reason for segregation, and that's the problem that these Japhites have. And I don't think he's just a Jewish supremacist, Zionist supremacist, but the Henry Jaffa, permanent revolution, Trotskyite nonsense that is basically in their DNA leads to conclusions like all we need to do for barrio Mexicans that have turned California into a shithole is read the Constitution and understand Judeo-Christian values. So you can't really oppose any of this stuff if you agree with all their premises. I think one of the wisest things that Dissident Right ever said was actually a bunch of pickup artists. Buy the frame, buy the farm, right? If you buy the frame of the enemy's argument, and you've conceded all the underlying basis points, you're cooked. You're going to lose. Yeah. And that's essentially what these guys do, is they buy the framing of the left.
One thing I find really curious is when you look at these like consortium of Jewish run groups, they are kind of pursuing like this pincer movement. Because on one hand, you have like these Japhaites that they will use a form of cafeteria, like nationalism, as you will, where they pick and choose certain facets of nationalism to advance their ethnic supremacist agenda that actually are sometimes rational. Like the Japhites, to their credit, they will talk about using state power to crush certain degenerate facets of American culture, which I would generally agree with. But yeah, they obviously stop at the JQ, but then you have like the Bill Kristol types are just like naked multiculturalists. They let all that hang out. But when you see how they move, like in the aggregate, it moves in a like Jewish supremacist direction, like all roads lead to it. And even like Ben Shapiro, man, one thing about these guys is they have a chameleon-like quality of blending in to like the environment and like calibrating their political takes and political movements to whatever environment they're operating in. Because I remember well over a decade ago, like Shapiro was pretty much like talking about how he doesn't like care about like the browning of America. It was boosting mass migration. But then fast forward, like say 5 or 4 or even like 4 years ago, he's now sounding like kind of like an immigration restrictionist and all of that. And you can even find examples of Bill Kristol, like whenever he was more of a Republican, sharing like some reasonable takes. But it seems to me that all this ideological bickering they have is really like a skin suit for like an ethnic supremacist agenda. And like in like the long run, as you said, they're just going to advance their ethnic group, their tribes' goals at the expense of the Goyim.
Harry Jaffa, right? I'm just looking up his Wikipedia, right? And born in New York City, right? And he actually wrote a thesis, Thomism and Aristotelianism. And he went to Yale and then the New School, which, if you know anything, right, that's totally like Marxist Jewish. And I don't know if he was a convert, but he was definitely born a Jew. And then he moved to Claremont McKenna College in the mid 60s. And that's how Claremont McKenna became, one of the few places that you could actually get a PhD. And of course, like he was West Coast Straussians, quoting from Wikipedia here, Claremontsters. His protégés can be found at Claremont and other colleges, including Hillsdale and the University of Dallas, which is a conservative Catholic college. Clarence Thomas Jaffa has influenced his judicial views, right? So he's one of these guys that will trace that, like naturally the principles of Aristotle naturally lead to liberalism, Lockean liberalism. And like Abraham Lincoln is the full flowering of like Aristotle's thought. And like, I'm not entirely sure that's a good idea, buddy. So you can't deal with any of this without dealing with the fact that he's a Jew living in America, essentially parasiting off the commons, and that you just can't let Jews have a say because they're not us and they're hostile to us. And like Robert Bork believed the Constitution was kind of silent on abortion, gay rights, and that left it up to the 10th Amendment. And Jaffa sitting here, no, you're wrong. It's natural law principles. And effectively, right, like they're saying, like, well, I feel this way about things, therefore that's actually what the founders intended. That's actually what Lincoln and the better angels of our nature really, really have to say. And of course, he's buddies with Bill Buckley. And anyway, it's to give them a great deal of credit, right? They are the most morally serious people in the establishment, right? So the main East Coast Straussian, right, is Walter Burns, and he went to Reed College in Portland, Oregon, which is one of the most radically leftist places in America. And then went to the University of Chicago for his PhD. So these are both, like Jaffa, yeah, he sure went to Yale, but he got his new school, like the new school was his PhD. And he would, and the new school, now let me look this up here, was founded by, like literal communists. The new school established is University in Exile and the École Libre des Hautes Études for, to largely Jewish scholars escaping from Nazi Germany, among the other adverse regimes in Europe. So like it was founded by, all these, Charles Beard was one of them, but like absolutely the place that the cultural Marxists went to, it was these kind of places like Marx and or Adorno and those kind of places. So how can you, get your PhD at the new school and be like, I'm a conservative? Conservating what? Conserving Western values?
Yeah, conserving global homo. I mean,
right. Yeah, that's their main mission, really, is conserving yesterday's leftism. And that's really the important thing that our people need to understand. I think most of them do nowadays, is if you buy certain leftist premises, you're going to get leftist results. And if you wind the clock back to 1955 without understanding where things went wrong, you'll just end up back in the same place. And most of these people just want to go back to like 1994.
Yeah.
Right before the Don't Ask, Don't Tell and public acceptance of homosexuality or whatever. Like they want to go back 30 years ago because they're deeply uncomfortable with how insane our society is. And like, well, yeah, I'm deeply uncomfortable with how insane our society is too. But unlike you, I'm willing to admit that one of the reasons our society is insane is we tried to make it so that like men and women are equal, or that blacks and whites are equal, or that Jews and Gentiles are the same. And all of these things are just not true on a deeply, foundational level. Like men and women are totally different. Non-whites and whites are different. Jews and Gentiles. And these guys can't admit that because that would doom their whole project. Because if blacks and whites are completely different, then Lincoln's a monster. The civil rights regime is a monster. John C. Calhoun's right about things.
Now, one thing this reminds me too, because of a post I wrote about a few months ago, it dealt with a lot of like the National Review style purges of many people on the right in the 20th century. And I'd say that these type of purges, and not just like National Review, but the whole conservative structure, based on what you observed from Claremont, have they purged any notable intellectuals that have like stepped out of bounds and started talking about taboo subjects like the JQ or related issues?
I don't know, but I don't honestly. I keep an eye on them. It's like you'd keep an eye on a local dangerous animal, but I don't follow them because I know what they're about. I will say that they've obviously tried to co-opt the post for listeners that haven't been around as long. What happened in the late 2000s is conservatism died with W. Bush. Right? There was after the disaster of the Iraq War, there was the libertarian moment with the Ron Paul revolution in 2008. and again, to a lesser extent in 2012. And that's what launched the neo-reactionary movement, is understanding that, like, oh, there's no, like, libertarianism. These people don't want to be free. Enough people read the bell curve and a few other things. Mole bug, quite obviously, not a big fan of Mitt Romney, but when he said, only 52% of the people are actually paying taxes, of course, these 48% are just not going to vote for anything sensible, right? He's completely correct there. And what happened is enough Curtis Yarvin. Twitter was just now a thing, and so those of us who were on Twitter at the time were able to kind of connect with each other, and there was a real intellectual foment around these sorts of issues, and we kind of broke off. And the second you actually start asking real questions, you end up coming to the conclusion there's something wrong with these Jews, man. There's something weird about these people, and that's what launched. That ultimately ended up in Charlottesville and other stuff. The Daily Stormer was still on the clear web and not harassed, and other people the right stuff. There was a real intellectual movement to get to the roots of where our modern problems were. There was the first BLM stuff, and after Michael Brown, right? And those of us who knew what was up were just like, oh, this is just TNB, right? Like, it's just what they do. And it was getting impossible to reconcile, because in 2003, right, Dick Cheney, like, ultimately, ultimate neocon, we'll be greeted as liberators. Like, well, the Iraqis don't seem to think so, bro. Sounds like they don't really want your freedom. Sounds like the idea of the permanent Trotskyist revolution, of that everyone on the inside is a Jeffersonian Democrat, is kind of nonsense, actually. Just look at it at the ground, like Afghanistan, Iraq, like, maybe these places, they don't want to be Jeffersonian Democrats. 20 years later, right? Like, who doesn't have, like, they have the Bakabazi thing, and obviously it's disgusting. They don't have laws on the books in Afghanistan that, like, you can trans a kid. Now, obviously, Islam is deeply hypocritical with this sort of subject, but they don't have a birthright rate problem of, like, their society's going extinct. Their women actually get married and have kids. And that's maybe the Jeffersonian Democrat thing is not working out long term. And the obvious failure of the neoconservative project, neoconservative foreign adventurism abroad, like, spawned a reaction to itself. And the idea that everyone wants to be a moderate right-wing Democrat, small d Democrat, with sensible tax laws and a firm respect for the sacred tradition, but not dogmatic about it, a la, Republicans from 1985 to, 2005, is just wrong. Some people, like, they're fundamentally different, and once you accept that, like, certain premises necessarily follow. So, like, the idea that the problem with the black population in America is that they just haven't had enough constitution. What if they can't constitution? And that's how we end up here. And the rest of the establishment, right? Claremont has actually been capable of reading the signs of the times and going, oh, we're in real trouble as a country, because things are falling apart here. We Jews just assumed we'd have this Anglo-Saxon. We could be the master blaster. We'd have this Anglo-Saxon blaster to carry us around, for big strapping 6'2", blonde-haired, blue-eyed Saxon that we could just kind of carry around that could bear us under the weight. And, like, well, we replaced his arms and his legs with Africans and mestizos and Polacks, and maybe he's not as strong as he was when he was a pure Anglo-Saxon. And they at least realized what time it was.
Yes, I agree that the Claremont types are much more politically savvy in terms of reading where the winds are blowing politically, because the Bush era completely discredited, in my opinion, the Bush Reaganite fixation with kowtowing to big business, boosting mass migration and also supporting these never-ending conflicts on behalf of like organized Jewry. I would add too that all of this stuff is just like insanely unpopular and it's rejected at the polls. Just look at Prop 187 in California. And the Claremont Institute, to its credit, has picked up on that. And that's why like the National Review, as we were talking off air, it's a ghost town now because they simply did not read the room and get with the times, politically speaking. So Claremont, in its defense, has embraced certain forms of populist policies, but when the rubber meets the road, they serve a specific master, and that's a master that does not care about the historic American nation or white European civilization in the US. And if anything, Claremont does, I think, have a mutual interest with the Judeo-American empire in that it's going to become attractive given how it's going to bring in more competent people in the governing apparatus to like preserve this empire for a bit longer, because the way the Judeo-American empire is going right now, it's on an accelerationist course to just total collapse.
To your point, right? Like Haifa in Israel is Israel's major port. It's no longer safe. The Jewish elite, following the clean break memo, basically started wars in every Middle Eastern country that was, for lack of a better term, illiberal, and used that illiberalism as a source of political and social and moral and economic strength. The Arab fascism of the Ba'ath Party of Iraq and Syria, the kind of Pan-African Green Book stuff that Gaddafi believed in Libya, kind of the strong arm stuff in Egypt. Like the Jews destroyed, of the 7 countries or whatever that they said that they were going to destroy, they destroyed like 4 or 5 of them. They can't do it to Iran just because we don't have the heft anymore. And because they believed fundamentally that in the interchangeability of human beings and kind of the blank slatism of liberalism, they thought that you could just import tens of millions of Mexicans and South Americans, and that they would be the same as like, the Anglo-Saxon Protestants that you convinced to use birth control, and like, oh, well, we're just fungible units, right? And obviously that's not true, and obviously that's a failure, and Bill Kristol now is like an open, just like Democrat, because for all of his, I run Commentary Magazine, and Tucker Carlson's called him pretty stupid, and Tucker Carlson used to work for him. So once you have the JQ glasses on, like, it just becomes obvious that this guy's just a Jewish supremacist. He has no underlying like philosophical convictions that would, he just believes in Jewish supremacy. And unfortunately for them, right, Anthony Blinken is a Jewish supremacist who's like nowhere near as competent as Henry Kissinger. And so you've got, multiple Jewish wars, the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, the war in Lebanon. I would argue the invasion in Europe and the United States are both low-level civil conflicts that amount to a war. So you've got all these wars that the Jews started, and for 100% like factual, Alejandro Mayorkas was a board member of HIAS before he became the Secretary of Homeland Security, which is ironic.
Explain
right?
What HIAS is.
Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and they're a major NGO that engages in people smuggling. But my friend Mike Panovich has on his Substack like an article, basically like thousands of words long, where he essentially proves that the entire immigration crisis in Europe is Jewish. It's a Jewish plot from beginning to end. And of course, the immigration invasion in the United States, right? Hart-Celler Act, 1965. Emanuel Celler was the man behind it. Celler is Jewish. So both the invasion of Europe and of the United States, the Browning and Great Replacement of the white world, are Jewish. And unfortunately for them, right? Like, not all people are interchangeable. And their Jewish wars, they're losing them. And at some point, you're going to run up against reality, and they have, and it's not going well for them.
Yes, and this may anger some pro-Trump listeners here, but I have argued since October 7th elements of the corporate media donor class and just like the deep state, they've actually warmed to Trump more lately because they're kind of recognizing that you can have like DEI in the private sector for like certain stuff that's not critical, that's not as critical for the US empire, but when it comes to like the commanding heights of the economy and especially the military, this empire is not going to be very sustainable. So they're actually extending an olive branch to more whites. And you can see this with Trump's selection of JD Vance as well as VP, that they are trying to bring back more whites into the governing structures in an attempt to like bring them back, because the way I think that things are going through the multicultural, multiracial blueprint that has been installed in DC, I just think that does not augur well for Empire Judaica in the long and actually more like in the short and medium term, because I think it is accelerationist. Whereas I do think that there is a concerted effort now to prop up Trump because it can give the empire more breathing room by bringing back some whites into the mix. Because when you just look at it, the current like regime roster is basically idiocratic, man. This is like idiocracy 2.0.
Instead of idiocracy, like a bunch of idiotic 14-year-old boys' idea of a cool government, we got the fact wrong that it's like a bunch of idiotic 14-year-old girls' idea of right. Excuse me, I'm speaking.
Yeah.
What? Well, what are you saying? Is there anything of actual value coming out of your mouth? What are you saying? What are you trying to communicate? And there's effectively, this woman will speak for, Kamala Harris will speak for an entire paragraph, and it's completely a null set in terms of what she's actually said, in terms of actual information conveyed. If I tell you, Jose, it is raining outside, there's information conveyed. You say, oh, well,
yes,
it's raining, right? Like, and I believe that I will go for a walk today. Like, I'm telling you something, and everything that this woman says conveys nothing, like absolutely nothing. And she's obviously stoned on something all the time. She's very stupid. And I just can't imagine that if she wins or it's stolen, one of the two. I tend toward the latter view, but that's just me, that the people she has running things will do it competently, because they're obviously not doing it competently right now.
Yeah, definitely not.
To quote one of the favorite conservatives, right, Richard Weaver, ideas have consequences, right? And when the conservatives were like, men and women are basically the same, blacks and whites are basically the same, as well. Okay, let's see how bold move, Cotton. Let's see how it works out for him, right? Like, it's not going to work. You can't put women and hysterical Jews and DEI hires in all of these places of real legit importance and have it work. Look at what's happened with FEMA.
Oh yeah.
Like a literal woman is in charge of FEMA, look at that. It isn't working.
Yes, I think that there is like a growing, well, also as well, because things are getting really like tragicomic with Empire Judaica, because the golems that these Jews created, these multiracial golems and like non-whites, they're actually starting to revolt against their masters in a way by calling out like Israel's punitive campaign in Gaza. And that's another factor that should not be ignored, in addition to the competency crisis, that there's so many contradictions starting to emerge in the system that they're scrambling to try to patch it up together, because if it continues the way it has been the last few decades, it's gonna it's gonna invariably collapse within the next decade. And it's also akin, if you think about it too, when Stalin got basically ditched Lysenkoism and then like just embraced more like hard realist geopolitics and industrialization to turn the Soviet Union to like an
Industrial,
industrial superpower. Yeah, they're that's kind of like the moment they're at right now.
I don't think I don't think they have they might have the ruthlessness of Stalin, but they don't have the willpower and his ability. I mean, I'm not a fan of Joseph Stalin at all. He was one of history's greatest monsters. But say what you will about the tenets of, Bolshevism in one country, but at least it's an ethos, right? The guy was able to accomplish something pretty incredible. And actually, Marshal Zhukov deserves more credit than Joseph Stalin, I think, because he was able to take an army where only every other guy had a rifle and hold off the Wehrmacht. But the thing that Stalin had that these guys don't have is a backstop in the United States. The United States sent enough material from Iran up through the Caucasus for 40 divisions. There were 10,000 aircraft that got flown halfway around the world from Montana up through Canada, through Alaska, and all the way across Siberia. That might have been enough to, they made a movie with Tom Hanks, about the convoys that were going to the Soviets, and their one port on the east side of the Finnish peninsula, New Archangel, it's only open, like some months of the year. It's the wintertime is completely frozen, but the millions and millions of tons of food and blankets and trucks and rifles and everything just sent, from the factories of the UK and the United States, mostly the United States, to Soviet Russia, enabled Soviet Russia to survive and win the war. And unfortunately for these people, like, where's your source of power now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
You destroyed America. Scots Presbyterians did not destroy America, but Catholic immigrants did not destroy America. So it's my family, right? The people that destroyed America are Jews. And it was Jews behind the sexual degeneracy movement. It was Jews behind feminism. It was Jews behind abortion. It was Jews behind birth control. It was Jews behind the suburbanization of America. It was Jews behind pornography. It's Jews behind the Immigration Act. It's Jews behind divorce. It's Jews behind the Civil Rights Acts. It's Jews behind deindustrialization and shipping stuff overseas. Like every single thing that you can point to as having a major negative effect on the destruction of America from 1950, when we're destroyed the world like a colossus, and the present, 75 years later. Every single thing that has substantially weakened the United States of America is Jewish at its root. All of them. And that's not me being an anti-Semite or whatever. Like, look into them.
Yeah, pattern recognition.
Pick something negative that has weakened America's ability to project strength abroad. Integration, Jewish. Feminism, Jewish. Liberalism, Jewish. Communism, Jewish. Pick whatever, and it's Jewish.
Yes, and when you look at all of this put together and bringing it back to like the rise of Claremont and these other kind of like anti-neocon Israel first right movements, they're really ultimately a de-radicalization operation, because as it becomes abundantly clear that the US is collapsing and people start going down the rabbit hole of the JQ and start noticing things, the knives are going to be drawn out. And for most people, they're going to start identifying the right targets. So organized Jewry is going to have to use certain type of like distraction and diversion ops, like propping up these groups to keep people from...
I remember, 3-4 years ago, there was massive excitement because BAP was being published in, the Claremont Review of Books. Well, it turns out, right, Claremont Review of Books, who's heavily influenced by Spencer Klavan, gay Jew, is publishing books by Kostin Alamaru.
Yeah, his real name.
Gay Jew. And again, they're the best establishment conservative outfit out there. They will at least admit what time it is.
Yes.
They will
talk about racial stuff. Like BAP talks about racial stuff. I'll see that. Yeah.
Yeah. But all of these people, Longhouse, bro. No, I'm not. Dude, I'm world famous misogynist. I'm not I'm woke on the women question, man. It's okay. That's the Jews, dude. Like feminism was a Jewish thing from the beginning. And it was certainly feminists that made Jewish feminists that made it as big a problem as it is now. And there's just no way, right? You can't address any of this stuff unless you deal with the JQ, right? And who is it? Paul Gottfried, God bless him, has a great article over at Chronicles magazine from 3 years ago, July 13th, 2021, clearing up the confusion on Leo Strauss, right? So Gottfried, a Jew, is talking about Leo Strauss, a Jew, and Leo Strauss and the Conservative Movement in America, a book that he wrote. Gottfried, like Walter Burns, Jewish, who went to, I mentioned him earlier, Alan Bloom, Jewish, and the West Coast Straussians, Jaffa, Jewish, are having this internal fight. And you can read the article on Chronicles, and Chronicles is one of the few good magazines out there. But again, this is all like Jews talking amongst themselves about how best to manage their golem of the United States. And they're all just wrong. What the United States ought to be is what the founding document said it was for us and our posterity. Northern European, mostly Anglo people. That's who the Constitution in America was intended for. There was no notion of like Bantus from like Central Africa to be like co-equal with everyone else. Tibetans. What are you talking? Like, no, this is ridiculous. And ultimately, personnel is the policy. And you can't change all the personnel in America from tough, hardy Scots-Irish frontiers people to people from literally every place on the planet and expect things to go well. And that's the fundamental dilemma that the Jews are running into right now. It's like, it's the ship of Theseus, like at what point is this still America? You swap out the population and you swap out the, you swap out the leadership and you swap out the, all because of these Jewish ideas about racial equality or feminism or whatever. And it greatly weakens the society. And at what point is it still the same society? The Scots-Irish hillbillies have been devastated by, called them pillbillies, right? Well, who was it that gave them Oxycontin? It was the Jewish Sackler family, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Why are the Chinese so like have effectively declared unlimited warfare on the West? Well, because the opium wars in China were started by the Sassoon family, right? Like this is not right. Like this is not a paranoid conspiracy theory. It is
an accurate read of history.
You just like a day on Wikipedia, for those of you who might not be convinced, block out, get a cup of coffee or two, have it ready to go. And whatever you think the main problem is, whether it's feminism or pornography or birth control or abortion or liberalism or integration or civil rights, or like, you will find Jewish people at the keystone of all of it. Every single thing that's weakened or destroyed America in the last 80 years has either been in whole or in part a Jewish production. And that's just the truth. And what the Japhaites are trying to do by publishing people like BAP and acknowledging the realities of race without actually just saying, we need to reinstitute segregation or be honest about it, like our friend Pete has been on talking about, like race-worn high school or whatever. What the Japhaites are trying to do is acknowledge enough of the truth so as to not completely wreck the ship. Unlike, say, Bill Kristol, who just wants to completely wreck the ship because he so hates ordinary white people that he would rather see America destroyed in the name of Jewish supremacy, because, like, in the back of his tiny little lizard brain, a reasonably strong, healthy white country, he hears the hoofbeats of Cossacks in his sleep, as I believe.
Yes.
Right. Like there's always a Khmelnytsky, like, just over the horizon. That's what's fundamentally the war in Ukraine is about too. Like, we're on the verge of nuclear war with Russia, because Victoria Nuland is like still salty about a pogrom from 375 years ago.
So we've hit well over the hour mark, but before we leave, what advice would you give listeners to the show about certain figures to be cautious about from the Claremont Institute and just other works that you believe are like are pretty subversive, just so that people know that like they need to be careful about what they're consuming, because they can be led down a primrose path of just ideological obfuscation.
I think that you need to be very, very careful about a couple things. Like I said earlier, trying to do politics without understanding the JQ or race, which is like trying to do physics without Newton's laws of motion. You're just going to be wrong in all kinds of different ways. So make discern for yourself. Is this person not talking about the JQ because they want to stay on YouTube, or are they like actively trying to? That's an exercise for the reader. Like, is this guy just not talking about this because he can't, or is he not talking about it because he's, hostile? And I think that that's pretty discernible according to, what the way people talk about things. I think it's pretty easy to actually read between the lines on stuff. Now, obviously, the people you should be listening to the most are the people that are just not going to lie about any of it. But when you're paying attention to mainstream sources, keep this sort of thing in mind. And be very, very skeptical of even somebody like Paul Gottfried, who I otherwise admire very much. My whole idea of what fascism
is. He's solid.
But Paul Gottfried has been exiled from, he should be up there with Harvey Mansfield and Henry Jaffa as like an eminent intellectual. But he's, relegated to this tiny magazine Chronicles and not nearly as respected as he should be, because he actually believes in permanent things like race is real and men and women are different and that kind of thing. So I would just pay attention to who is, cui bono, who's benefiting and what are they not saying, and just be very extremely skeptical of any Jews, and that will lead you right most of the time, I think. And in my opinion, they've pushed the envelope too far. You can't do what they've done in the last year, since October 7th of last year, and keep the mask on. You just can't. And I think that particularly for younger people, the uncle's speeches on TikTok translated to being, widely broadcasted, and the truth is just coming out because it's so very, very obvious in a way that it wasn't even 20 years ago, that people will actually be able to address the issues as they are actually exist. And like AA, the one great spiritual contribution the United States of America has made to the world, right? The first step in solving any problem is admitting you got a problem.
Yes.
And if we just admitted that, like, hey, like Jews are in charge, they run everything. They run the banks, they run the media, they run social media, they run all this stuff. And they've done so to the detriment of the main host population, then we could at least come to some sort of like, okay, Ben Shapiro, what are you doing in Tennessee? Why are you not in Los Angeles? Why shouldn't people from Tennessee, why shouldn't my people, Scots Irish hillbillies from Appalachia, be able to say, we don't really want you here in Tennessee, Benji, because you're a subversive Jew and this is ours and you can't have it. You can't go advocate. You can't be sitting in Tennessee advocating that my kids or my kith and kin, come out of the mountains one more time for you and your people and go start a pointless war in the Middle East. Every war in the 20th century, from the war in Spain, war with Spain in 1898, up through, 9/11, was fake and gay, right? Like even the Gulf War, right? Like Saddam Hussein went to our ambassador and said, Kuwait is stealing my oil. What do you want me to, like, what can I do? And our ambassador said to him, like, hey, that's an internal Arab matter, man. You deal what you got to do. So he was like, oh, okay, fine. I'm going to invade Kuwait and tell him to stop stealing my shit. And then all of a sudden, right? Well, he knew what was up. He was launching scuds at Tel Aviv because he knew he was ultimately responsible for the invasion of his country and the destruction of his people, right? Gulf of Tonkin and Pueblo incident in Korea. Like, at what point do we just admit some things that are real and deal with it?
Yep, I think what you sounded off on, DE, is very important for my listeners to keep in mind, because you have to ultimately be wise about your media consumption, or else you're just going to overdose on really crappy content. But anyways, man, where can my audience find your latest like musings against organized Jewry and the corrupt ruling class?
Well, I'm on Telegram mostly, and I believe you got links to both my backup channel. It's not Apple banned, and my main channel. I can be found once a month on Thought Crime Syndicate with yourself and Pete Quinones and our friend Charles Padil on Pete Quinones' show. I've got up my own project in the works. I'll let you know when that launches, but I do have something that's on background, as they say, and working on that slowly. So I do thank you for having me on. And like I said, you've been doing a really, really good job, I think, lately of dealing with the world as it is. So thank you very much.
No, I appreciate the kind words. I believe like that. It was great that Pete brought us together, because we've been able to exchange like high level ideas and come to like even better understanding of the current system. Because I never would have thought like 10 years ago that I'd be reaching these same conclusions. But yes, I always find your contributions to be thought provoking, and at times actually challenge some of my prior premises of like political observations. So I do believe that you have made some great contributions to this space, and I also think that my audience is gaining a lot of knowledge from this. And as always, like I appreciate their attention.
One last thing, actually, Jose, if you don't mind, folks. I forgot to say this before, but please, subscribe to Jose Substack. Click him, a latte a month, $3. It's not much, but support the people that aren't going to lie to you. And I say this not just because Jose is my friend or that Jose is kind enough to have me on, but if you want like good sources of information that don't treat the lives of your children as like fodder to be like either, used up in some sort of, drug induced, profit making scheme for big pharma, or sent to some useless war in the Middle East, or just used as tax cattle. You need people that don't lie to you and are in the public space telling the truth about who's responsible for all of this stuff. And, Jose, gave up a pretty lucrative career in conservative ink to tell the truth, so please just support the people that support you. That's all I ask. And I want to thank Jose for doing that and actually being brave enough to sacrifice a pretty comfy living talking about my Constitution and guns to go where the truth led. And I applaud him for that. And the only reason I'm here is that Jose did that and was brave enough to talk to people like me. So if he's brave enough to put everything on red, you should be brave enough to kick him $10 a month or whatever it is. Please.
Thank you so much, D. And yes, all the help that y'all can pitch in goes a long way in making sure that I can bring on great guests and put out better content, because ultimately we cannot operate as atomized individuals. We're all in this struggle together in one way or the other. And yeah, with that, El Nino Speaks is signing off.